speakers, each with their own unique connection to St. Ben's and St. John's. Brett Lund is a current sophomore majoring in theology and has a minor in global health and psychology. He's a member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and when he's not immersed in his studies, Brett enjoys reading scripture or theological texts, playing basketball, and performing on the piano. Jim Platten, on my far left, is a graduate of St. John's, class of 74. He's worked in the St. Paul Hospital and seen the challenges and grief that people experience through illness. He was able to study with his mentor, Father Kieran Nolan, at St. Christopher's Hospice, which is the first hospice in the world, and has worked in this field in many capacities for 52 years. Married to his wonderful wife, Beth, in the back middle there.
Or Barb.
They have a daughter.
Or Barb. Barb.
Barb. What'd I say? Oh, I'm sorry. They have a daughter named Sharon. Did I get that one right? Oh.
You just don't like me, do you?
Okay, third time to try. Do you have a granddaughter named Elena?
We do.
Great. They have a granddaughter named Elena, who is a junior here at St. Ben's, as well as 2 other grandkids. And Abbot Doug, to my left here, is a Johnny, Tommy, and University of Minnesota alum who's received a multitude of degrees in an array of impressive areas. He was an educator and served as principal on the the Red Lake Indian Reservation, and has been the Dean of Students and Director of Red's Life at St. John's Prep. He was a department chair here at St. Ben's and St. John's, and served as the SJU Vice President for Student Development. And as if that wasn't impressive enough, he was the chaplain at the St. Cloud Veteran Affairs Hospital and just completed his first year as abbot at our own St. John's Monastery. Let's give it up for our 3 panelists. Without further ado, let's get started. Abbot Doug, I'd like to start off with the basics. Can you tell us just a brief definition of grief? What is grief and what does it encompass?
Sure. So grief, to understand grief is a process for dealing with loss. Now, there's all kinds of losses that we have. We can lose weight and be glad about that. That's not necessarily the grief we're talking about. Oftentimes we think about grief as a loss of someone close to you, oftentimes through death. But it can also be the process of dealing with the loss of a relationship. It can be the loss of a future. Something happens, or you didn't pass a test and it has a great implication. The grief can come up at any point, but it's really the emotional process, emotional response to dealing with the loss. So when we're talking about the grieving process, it's about leaning into the grief and accepting it, as opposed to saying, I'm not going to deal with that. I'm just going to go on with life. Nothing happens. That usually comes out in bad ways for us. But when we grieve, we lean into the emotions, the very uncomfortable emotions. And they can vary for different people at different times. It can be sadness. It can be a sense of anger. It can be a sense of just being lost. I don't know what to do. How do I move forward? These are all different responses, and there's no one right response to grief. Whatever your own emotions are, the important thing is to feel those emotions and to process them. The way we process the emotions is by usually talking about them. It can be writing things out, talking to someone, talking to yourself. Usually it's best to talk with somebody that can accompany you through this. The reason that's so important is because then there can be questions about things that you're not necessarily addressing. So accompaniment of a person with grief is the way in which we minister to each other through this.
Thank you. Brett, you have a lot of life experience already as a sophomore. Can you tell us a little bit about how grief has been present in your own life?
Well, this is definitely a great question. And Abbot Doug, thank you for a great definition of grief. I'm going to make this long story short because I could go on for about 20 minutes talking about it all. But Junior year in high school, I was living like the best life I could have ever been living. I was in the best physical shape. I was in my best spiritual, and I was doing so well in my faith. And I was doing so well, I never thought I could ever experience anything bad. Well, then that's when you get to that point you don't expect things to happen, but they do. It all started off when I lost my grandma on December 4th of 2021. That day was a blow because none of us seen that one coming. My family did not know it was going to happen at all. It was literally just a call saying she was in the hospital, and then we didn't know what even happened, and then we found out she just passed away in the hospital. So that was a really big blow, and it was right before the holidays, so that was difficult, and didn't end there, sadly. My family's in the back, so 6 months later, less than 6 months later, in my junior year, May 26, 2022, I lost my dad to cardiac arrest. And something that I struggle with. I don't know why he had to leave so early. And then not too long after that, in January 23rd of 2023, my dog died. So that was a lot of death in those few months. And I also lost myself. I didn't know who I was. I lost parts of myself. I didn't know who I was going to be or how I was going to get through it. It was a lot of deep and abiding loss for myself, my family, and everyone who knew my grandma and my dad.
Thanks for being vulnerable with us, Brett. Another thing I want you to touch on, as well as Jim, is how you can experience grief with other people, or how you can accompany other people. Can you guys talk about the role of accompaniment in walking with others through grief?
Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can. So from my side, I think the best thing that helped me, of people accompanying me through my own grief, is just being present. And this probably ties into other questions down the road, but that's all you can really do, be present. Because despite people's good intentions, when people are going through grief, you don't ever want to say, oh, they're in a better place. Oh, or they're out of their pain. There's good intention in that, but you don't ever want to say that to someone who's going through loss, because that invalidates what they're going through. And that's a hard thing to grasp. And another thing that I realized, when someone who's crying over their loss, the common thing is to go grab a tissue, and so they can wipe their eyes. Again, that's a good gesture, but those emotions need to be let out. And we shouldn't be trying to hide them. So like I said, there's just so many nuanced things that I've learned that we can do to better accompany people. So just being present with them is what I would say.
It's a great point. Thank you. Thank you for your story. I know that's hard and it's tough, so thank you so much for that. I think when we talk about grief and loss, it's one of those topics that is really, in a lot of ways, the infancy of our awareness, our understanding of it. I was going back through some stuff when I was approached about coming to this panel, and I've been doing this kind of work for forever. When I was your age, when I was in between my senior year in high school and my freshman year in college, I started working at St. Joe's Hospital in St. Paul as an orderly, which is the 1970 version of a nursing assistant. And I did that work, and it was fun. It was interesting because I worked with a bunch of crazy guys that were just, fun to be around. But we were also doing some great work. In the summer between my freshman and sophomore year, a year later, I spent time almost every evening, because I worked a lot of evening shifts in the summer, with a family on the first floor of the North Wing in that hospital. The last name was Wells. I think the statute of limitations is up on that. Now we're a bunch of years past. But he was dying of cancer. And he was dying of cancer, and at the end of the hall, and suddenly all these people started just going down to that room and hanging out and just being with that family, being a part of that family. And we really started to understand it. Came back to school that fall, and Kieran Nolan and a couple of the other monastics and I were talking about this, and Kieran sort of mentored me through a lot of different things over those next years. And it was really interesting because one of the books that I ended up grabbing, and I couldn't find my original version of it, so I had to go out and buy a new one. So I have this updated version of the book Kubler-Ross on Death and Dying. And the reason that I want to bring that story forward is because when we talk about grief, when we talk about loss, and all these things, so if you have a loss, then you're going to grieve it. It's going to depend on where you're at with all that. What can we do about that? Because we need to understand how people get through grief. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in her book, talks about the stages of dying, the stages of grieving, and it's anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and those kinds of, and denial. And those are the stages of grief that she talks about. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Those things, those pieces of it. And is it really acceptance, or is it kind of coming to comfort with it? Is it that sort of thing? What is our role? What is our role as people who are nervous about talking to people about a death, nervous about talking with people about potentially dying? What can we do? And I think it really is, it's exactly what Brett said, it's what Doug said, it's being there, it's being present. You don't need a whole toolkit, you don't need a bunch of books. It's interesting how over the last 50 years, we've developed really good handouts, really good books that you can read, and they're quick 5, 10, 20-minute reads. And if you sit and reflect, it can really help you. But it's about being present. It's about using God's formula. I always call it God's formula of 2 ears and 1 mouth. And it's kind of like, that should tell you something. Maybe listening's more important than talking all the time. But it's also about when you hear something, or when you say something, those pauses in that conversation, especially in grief, those pauses can drive you crazy because that gap of noise is so loud. It's haunting, but it's about really giving them the space to be where they are so that they can say what's next, and giving them the space to know that it's okay to take the time to be sad, to cry, to let those tears flow, to swear like a sailor, whatever. And it's okay because they're going through what they're going through and they need that space. And so, we'll talk more about this over the next 45 minutes or so, but it's really about being at peace. And it's about, if you're interested in learning more about this, there's going to be lots of ways for you to figure that out, and we can help you. All of us here, we want to help. Because the more we can be there for people that are going through grief and loss, the better they will come out. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Ed and Doug, would you add an insight as to what are the most important things to keep in mind when we accompany somebody?
Yeah, I think what Brett and Jim said is really right on. I would maybe come at it from the opposite side of what not to do. They said very well, be with people, be present. What you should not try to do is short-circuit it. Try to bring comforts. Oh, it's okay. It's not so bad. Anything like this where you're trying to give comfort is disastrous because it's trying to short-circuit the process, and it says, I don't want to hear your sadness. I don't want to see any of that. And that's the wrong thing to do. People say, well, I don't know what to do or what to say when I'm with somebody, so I kind of avoid. That's wrong. Being present. How are you doing? And then whatever they say, pick up on that rather than try to give a response. Oh, like Brett said, saying to somebody they're in a better place, or I know exactly what that's like, and going on with your own story. That's not helpful. Letting the person talk through what they're feeling. That's what we really aim to do.
Yep. And I think just along that, if I can just I think when you trip like that and you say one of those things and you realize you've just said something that, Abbott Doug said we shouldn't say, it's okay. You can still recover from all that because you're there and you can be that undivided block of attention. That's the opportunity you've got. But if you can avoid saying that kind of stuff, but sometimes it's just our coping mechanism because it is uncomfortable. It's hard. And so don't feel like, oh boy, I really goofed that up. But, at the same time, just really kind of process with a friend before you sit down and get into a conversation with somebody who's grieving. Prepare yourself. Make sure you're in the right space so that you can give them undivided attention and undivided listening, using those ears.
I think to go off that, I just want to add on to this quick. I think we need to all think about what listening means too. Because, oftentimes we listen to have a response. But when you're accompanying people through grief, your goal of listening is just to listen. You don't need to have any sort of answer, or you just need to be there and listen fully just don't try forming out how you're going to respond to them in your head, because that is disastrous. So just being present, because that's...
And you're really not listening when you're thinking about your answer.
Yes, correct.
Jim, I'm going to come back to you now, and I'd like to focus on when we grieve ourselves. Now, can you talk about some tools that we're able to use when we engage with our own grief?
Yeah, sure can. Thank you for that question. It's really important. When we deal with loss, and Abbott Doug laid it out pretty nicely, that it's one of those things where loss is what we're responding to with grief. The first thing you have to remember is that when you have a grief situation, and I'm thinking about, Brett, your story, grief is one of these things, the challenging part of it is it's cumulative, okay? So if you have stacking of griefs one on top of another, all of a sudden now you've got all this different stuff that you're trying to sort out. And, it can be like losing a dog on top of all the other stuff. That could be a game changer. That can be really, really hard. So I think when some of the ways we can deal with grief ourselves is always be giving ourselves that space, that time that you need to grieve, and finding those personal sacred spaces, whatever that is. Where can I be where I can be okay for a while? When my dad died, 31 years ago now, we got through the funeral, we got through all that stuff. He died really young of cancer. He was only 74 years old, and he died of just cancer. It was just really quick. And after everything, I remember driving up here because I clearly identify this place as my spiritual home in so many ways. I got up to the top of that bridge off of 94, and I turned left, and I saw the bell tower, and I just started crying. And I knew I was in the right spot at the right time where I needed to be. But we've got to find the right sacred spaces, wherever that is, whatever that is. We need to have the right people around us. I'm blessed. I've got an amazing family. I've got a wife that, walks on water in my mind. And I've got a daughter that's pretty awesome too, although she can challenge us on occasion. You girls are tough, just so you know. But it's important to have a family that really can be there for you. And I think it's about really having those people that you can handpick, that you can talk to. I'm in a Johnny Brothers group, and we have some pretty awesome conversations. And I got to tell you, I hang out in the football equipment room down in Palestra. I got a couple of football pals here today, and it's like the conversation. Sometimes it's just that quick 2-minute conversation that just brings the temperature down. So those are some things. And then the last thing, and it's kind of the topic du jour, our faith. My faith gets me through a lot of this stuff. And my faith is really, really important to me because I know that I can talk to God. The nice thing is I can talk to God in church, but I can talk to him on a walk. And those conversations are really important for me because they help keep me grounded. And I'm kind of a nitpicky reader too, so that kind of helps a bit.
I'd love to continue that topic of looking at grief through the lens of faith. through the lens of faith. Evan, Doug, how can our faith and our theologies guide our engagement with grief? And especially, are there theologies that are possibly harming those facing grief?
Very much so. Great question. Thank you. So, I would say as Christians, one of the theology that is most important for us is the Paschal mystery, the dying and rising of Christ. He didn't short-circuit the whole process and just skip the Good Friday. He went through it all. He was abandoned. He felt alone. In fact, he even says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It is total abandonment. And that's a part of the grief process. He's losing his life, and he had faith, but he didn't know. Was this really going to work? Was he really going to rise again? He's so alone. We experience that. That is a part of the grieving process, knowing the ending. We hold on to hope because we know the ending and we go forward. Now, theologies that are not helpful are many. First of all, it's a punishing God. If you're suffering, you deserve it. Something's wrong with you. That is not helpful for anyone, and it's not the God we believe in, but it is the God that some people believe in. One story from when I was at the VA, a veteran came to see me. He had attempted suicide, and he was quite upset. The love of his life, his wife, had died. But before she died, while she was living, she was part of an evangelical church, and her son, it was a second marriage for her. Her son had come out as gay, and she was kicked out of the church because her son was gay. She died, and the pastor said, "Well, she has gone to hell." So the veteran thought the surest way that he could get to hell to be with her was to commit suicide. The whole theology of God does not welcome and love everyone is terribly harmful, and it's not the God we believe in. I've also told people that anytime someone tells you that they know the limits of God's love, tell them to go to hell. There is no limit that anyone can know. So.
Thank you. Brett, I want to circle back to you now and hear more about your life story. Are there ways that you continue to work through grief today? And what nuances of grief do you now understand after having gone through so many challenges?
Well, I just love this conversation and I love this question. So I didn't really get into all the grief I've experienced. I'll just share a little bit more. So a lot more grief came this past August, September. I had 5 deaths within about a month. That is nothing anyone should ever have to face, especially people college age. One of them ended up being a very, very, very close spiritual person to me, and she was very close with my family too. So that was really hard. But to address the question Tess asked, I've learned a lot. I've learned that every time someone says, "Oh, it happened so and so long ago," no. Grief is a never-ending process. It is something that we will carry throughout all our lives, because if we haven't experienced grief, if we don't carry it, we aren't really living, because we're all going to have those losses and they're always going to be with us. So it's about how do we how do we cope with it? How do we make sense of the world we live in? Because something I've realized is every time I lose someone, a part of me goes with them. So not am I only grieving the person I lost, but I'm grieving that piece of myself I no longer have. But how my faith has really shaped me, or helped me get through a lot of this loss. I think it all kind of started when I came to St. John St. Ben's. I'm so privileged, as we all are, to be in such a great place to connect with God and to just be around like-minded people. And it's really transformed my life. I've met so many great friends that have helped me through those challenging times. Because I look at the fact, there are people who go through much worse things and don't have the support system. So I think just we need to lean on our support system, but in that support system at the top, it should be God. Because God is with us every step of the way. And that is something I've started to really lean into because, every step I take, I'm not always going to have my mom or my family or my friends. But I kind of think of the story about the two sets of footprints in the sand. One's ours and the other is God. And He is always there. So I've really leaned into just praying more and reading the Bible and thinking about there's always a positive side. So something I've learned about grief is that, it does suck to lose people, but then you have to look at the other side of the spectrum. When people die, they fulfilled God's will. They fulfilled what God had wanted for them to do on this planet, faithfully and truly. God called them home. And that's just so beautiful to me because, it's so hard to grasp. But when I say, my dad was called home by God, I just sit there in awe, thinking about how good He did things. And I know He had His obstacles in life, and He had His troubles and has bad things in life that He did. But we all do that. God forgives us. So I think the moral of what I'm trying to get at is that grief is never ending. It's going to come in flows and ebbs. And I really liked how Jim talked about, how sometimes grief can compound on each other. Like when I lost that spiritual person, I broke down. I started crying about how I missed my dad, my grandma, and now her. I'm like, what is happening? Because it compounds because when you have so many significant people you lose like that, it just compounds. And like I said, I think the biggest thing for me though is I'm in the right place, and I'm gonna be honest, like I said, we are privileged to be here. And I think that's something that's really helped me, being in a place where I can practice my faith and be in a safe space. And I think that's what we talked about. That's what we need to get through grief.
Awesome.
For our last question, before we get into a Q&A session here, it's going to be for the three of you. Tug, if you wouldn't mind starting. How do we overcome being afraid of grief? And how can we find hope in the midst of grief, as it's a lifelong process?
So I think the idea of how do we overcome being afraid of it is simply to accept that it's here. I have the loss, I acknowledge the loss, and I know I have to do something about it. I can't just ignore it. And so to feel what's surging up within, it helps to seek out, if you're alone and don't really know what to do, if you don't have a friend that you trust that has come forward, seek out a chaplain, seek out a counselor, seek out somebody to talk to that will invite you to come forward. But it just needs to be somebody that you can be safe with. But there's always people around, but you got to feel comfortable. What was the second part of the question?
On hope.
On hope, yeah.
Hope
So again, I think I come back to the paschal mystery, that it is, God is always with us. And I agree with what Brett said, that The grief is always there, but it is transformed. It becomes something real and a sign of hope. And that's what keeps us going forward. We will survive. Oftentimes, well, actually, for this one particular veteran who was suicidal, one of the things that I just asked him about, what would your wife, what does she want for you? What has she always wanted for you? He said, she wanted me to live and be happy. That's what I wanted for her. So be blessed by her spirit and go forward. That spirit of her is blessing you. And that's where your life is now. Go back to the scriptures of where Mary Magdalene finds the risen Christ. And she thinks he's the gardener. She doesn't even recognize him. And then he calls her by name, and she recognizes who he is. And she reaches out to grab hold of him, and he pushes her away and says, don't hold on to me. I need to rise to my Father. And he needs to rise so that the Spirit can come to her. And that happens to us. The Spirit of those whom we loved, who made up our life, comes to fill us. That's hope.
Okay, I might add one more thing. I really appreciate talking about the hope. I think the thing that has really happened in my life, because I talked about how when you lose people or you lose opportunities, you lose a part of yourself. And a lot of people often say nothing will ever fill that void. But I argue, because I've experienced this myself, when you put you put your whole self and your faith in God, God will mend your brokenness. And I think that is another big thing, because when God does that, it gives you hope. It gives you hope to keep moving forward, because it reminds us, we're in a finite world. Our lives aren't going to be infinite, but what matters is our faith, because that will be infinite, and it will be a testament to the judgment day when we do leave. And I think that is just powerful.
I think being afraid of grief it's a big task to take on. Grief is just an uncomfortable topic, right? When you sit here and you think, when sitting here talking with a bunch of young, healthy college students, and we're talking about grief and loss and dealing with all of that, it can be kind of almost off-putting. And yet, you are so equipped to be able to be helpers on people's journeys as they come towards you. And they will come towards you because you are engaged human beings and you have the right tools. Brett talks about it. We're in this very blessed place. Doug talks about it for our faith, our love for God. But it's also for our love for each other. That we have this capacity that we may not even know we've got. But you'll start to develop it, you'll start to fill it out. Because it may not be helping somebody with death. It may be helping somebody out with a different kind of loss, where you're being there, helping them, talking with them. I have a friend of mine who we talk to each other every morning, and it's just the dumbest conversation on the planet. Hands down, can't be fixed. His dad died, his mom died, my dad died, then my mom died. We made a commitment to each other. We were going to check in on each other every day. This has been going on for 10 years, 12 years. It's just silly, makes no sense, but it's important for me to do that with him. And if I don't get that call, I call him. If he doesn't get that call, he calls me. Every day. And my wife's nodding her head back there, because she's heard some of the conversations, and they don't make a lot of sense. But it's not about being profound and deep. Now it's at this point of commitment. We've got to check on each other. I have a good friend who was on staff here at St. John's who just recently lost his father, completely unexpected, out of nowhere. I told him, I said, you can be Mr. Tough Guy with everybody else, but I'm going to check in on you to see how you're doing. And when you sign up for that stuff, there's only two things you got to do. Be equipped to make sure you do it, and be equipped to be present for that individual. It's not scary once you start to do it. And if you do it for one person, you can do it for a second, you can do it for a third, and you can do it. Some people are going to need that much, some people are going to need that much. It just depends. And you have, look around this room. Look around this room and all the people that are here that are like-minded in this room. And then you look on this campus and St. Ben's, like-minded. So that's where you find the hope in the midst of grief, because there are ways that we can get through it. And the last thing I want to just offer up, we recently lost a member of the monastic community who was a very dear friend to many of us, Wilfred. And Wilfred, Barbara and I would step up and see Wilfred. He was, oh my God, he was so delightful. He was such a dear man. I had a conversation with him. Barbara wasn't there that particular time. He had this look of peace on his face like I've never seen in my 70 plus years of wandering around this earth. And he was so at peace. And he said, I am so glad I'm going to be able to go home and be with God. And I walked out of there and I just sat there. I went down to the Great Hall. I sat down for a minute. I was having a hard time even walking. I couldn't process it. But I just saw acceptance at this level that I've been around this stuff for 50 years. And I just was like blown away by it because he was at peace. He was okay. And it's just, so once you do it a little bit, you start figuring it out. But you guys are awesome. This place is awesome and you're gonna be fine. And I got books if you ever want one. Brought a couple.
We've heard a lot of deep wisdom here tonight. Thank you, Emma, Doug, Brett, and Jim. Let's give it up for our panelists.